I'm going to go ahead and start the festivities. Thanks so much for being here, everybody. This is a music theory discussion. We're going to talk only about the most elementary kind of basic things about music theory, okay? We're going to cover pitch, we're going to cover scales, we're going to cover other concepts having to do with scales like modes, and if we have some time, we'll get into chords and chord naming and that kind of thing, but never really sure how long I'll talk. Never sure how verbose I'm going to be, so we'll see how that goes. Just a couple details before we get started. This is obviously a Zoom thing. If you have any questions while I'm talking, then go ahead and use the raise your hand feature. Heather, I think that's how we're going to do it, right? They'll raise their hand, and if they have a question, you can break in whenever it's appropriate to let me know about it. Does that sound about right?
That sounds great. And if they want to write it in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that too. They don't want to interrupt.
You might also want to pin my video, and I think it's a little different on different operating systems how you do that, but to full screen it and pin it, because I'm going to be doing some sort of graphical stuff here on the screen as well, and it might be hard to see if the video is not full size. When you do that, Zoom also floats a little window of the other video participants, and you can minimize that or move it around as you need. It might help get it out of the way of some stuff that might be on the screen, just so you're aware of that. Great, so I'm just going to jump in. We're talking here about music theory, and the point of doing this is to have a sort of a deeper intimacy with the music that we make, to have a visual way to think about it, to visualize what's happening, and to understand it on a deeper level. One overarching theme that I want to emphasize, and that we'll touch on a little bit more later, is to always use your ear when it comes to this stuff, to always trust and use your ear. We're going to learn a lot of different guidelines and rules and stuff, but in the end, your ear is often the fastest and best way to get to the awareness that you want. So we'll talk about that more a little bit later, but remember to keep that in mind. These are guidelines that we're going to be talking about. So how does music work? Music, the first thing we're going to talk about in terms of music is pitch. Not every musical sound has a pitch. Some short percussive elements, like maybe the hit of a cymbal, don't really have an identifiable pitch, but most sounds that you come across do in fact have a pitch. That might be the pluck of a guitar string, or the sound of a person singing, or a piano note, that kind of thing. Pitch, you can think of pitch as a line. I'm going to switch over to my little graphics thing here. You can think of pitch as a line. I'm going to draw it like this, and you can think of it as going from low to high, okay? When you pick some point on this line of pitch, right here, this is what we call a note. A note is just a spot on the line of pitch, right? Here's a note. Oh, let me turn that old graphic off, sorry. Here is a note. I have just sort of picked a floating point in the line of pitch, and I've called it a note. You can make this note go higher in pitch, like this, and it sounds like this. Or you can make it go down in pitch, like that direction. Right? You probably all know this already. We have terms for this. We call this getting sharp, and we use a little symbol that looks something like that to mean sharp, and we have a little symbol like this to mean flat, which is the other direction. Sharp means to go up in pitch, flat means to go down in pitch. All right. So this line of pitch, it extends infinitely higher and lower. I'm not drawing it, but it goes off the screen in either direction here. How do we start to break this down and understand music in a little bit more of a comprehensible way? Well, what we do is we pick a spot on the line of pitch. We called it a note, and we can play notes in combination with each other. Here's a few different combinations of notes. At some point, as these notes get a certain magical distance away from each other, we come upon a certain distance that we call the octave. I'm just going to draw this other note over here. And I'm going to call this distance on the line of pitch here, this is what I'm going to call an octave. You don't have to worry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to suggest, if people have it in gallery view, you might be really small. And if they switch to speaker view, then you would be more like full screen. So just for the visuals, that might help people. There
you go. Switch to speaker view, and that'll help you out. There's the octave. Don't worry about why it's called an octave. It's not really important at this point. There's esoteric reasons and history and stuff behind it, but just think of it as the term meaning the distance between these two notes. Now, what does that distance sound like? Here are two notes played an octave apart from each other, right? If I extend the distance a little bit, it sounds like this. And if I shrink it a little bit, it sounds like this. But when I play both of those notes an octave apart, it gets a really clean, what they call consonant sound. In fact, if you weren't trained in music or you weren't used to listening for it, you might not even be able to tell that this is two separate notes. You've got this note, and we've got this note, and together, they're an octave apart. So for now, all you have to understand is that once you get to a certain magical distance, you get an octave. And this is going to be useful to us, and I'll show you why. Before we had this really long line of pitch, right? We said it extends infinitely up and down. And what the octave allows us to do is to pick a note, and then we can find a note. I'm going to draw the octave over here now. I've just changed the scale of things, but let's call this is the octave distance, right? Well, this note here also has a note, an octave underneath it, and there's a note, an octave underneath that, and there's an octave above that. And the octaves go on the line of pitch forever as well. Now, the neat thing about an octave is that anything that happens in one octave, you can kind of just copy and paste into the next octave. If you've ever walked into a room where people are singing a song, depending on where your vocal register lies, you might have slotted into one octave or another. If you walk in and they're singing, "This land is your land, this land is my land," you might have walked in and started singing, "This land is your land, this land is my land." I'm singing the same melody, but I'm doing it an octave apart. All those notes were just this magical distance apart from each other. So if I'm singing "This land is your land" like this land is your, I'm singing notes down here. You can sing them up here, "This land is your land," or you can sing them up here, "This land is your," like that, right? So in some sense, this note, with its magical distance to another note up here of an octave, in some sense, these are the same notes. They're not technically the same note, but for all intents and purposes, our ears hear them as the same note because they're this magic distance apart. And that's going to simplify things a lot, because then all we have to do is worry about what happens in here, what happens in the span of one octave, and we can basically just copy and paste it into the octaves above and below it. So let's do that. We're going to zoom into one octave, and we're going to think a little more carefully about it. You're going to see on your screen here these two golden bars, right? These are representing the octave notes. So you will also see a little highlight here when I play a note. So there's the lower note, there's the higher note. That's the octave. You can play them together just like before. And what we're going to do is we're going to divide that octave up into 12 equal pieces. I'm going to turn that on. So you can see that you can ignore for now the stuff that's going on over here and the stuff that's going on over here. We're just caring about what's in between these two gold notes, right? These notes, this is 12 equal slices of the octave. There are notes in here. There's all these little notes in between, because pitch is just a fluid line, right? The line of pitch, you can just take it as read is behind all of this stuff, right? There are notes in between, but we've divided this octave up into these 12 equal slices, right? Why 12? Well, you don't have to worry about it for now. It's out of the scope of this talk, and there are plenty of musical traditions in the world that don't divide the octave up into 12 pieces. But for Western music, which is what we are mostly going to hear at a thing like the Bellingham Folk Festival, 12 is the magic number. We've divided it up into 12, and these we're going to take as the fixed places where we're allowed to have notes, right? I'll play through them real quick so you can check them out. Okay, those are the 12 notes that are in the octave. And again, in almost all the music you're likely to hear at a festival like this, and on the radio and in most places around the world at this point, the music is going to be using this kind of skeleton behind it. These 12 notes underlie pretty much everything. Sometimes they're bent or massaged a little bit, but that's the basic idea. So what we're going to do is play a sort of floor is lava game with these notes. We're going to play some of the notes, and we're going to ignore others of the notes. So I'm going to show that now. You can see that some of the notes are now lighter in color, okay? And this is what's called a scale. Scale is just when we choose some of these 12 notes and we play them, and then we skip the other ones. We don't use them. Again, we're just sort of ignoring what happens above and below the octave for now. So I'll play through these highlighted notes and listen to what that sounds like. This scale is just a subset of those 12 notes that we're playing. And your ear already knows this almost for sure. In fact, the Christmas carol, Joy to the World, is just a walk down this scale. Right? You know the scale is a melody already, most likely. And if I go to a note that's not in the scale, if I play one of the notes that's not highlighted on the screen there, your ear will notice it immediately. Right? It kind of sticks out in a way. So again, trusting your ear is really important as you learn this stuff. It really knows a lot already. So this scale is a special scale we call the major scale. And when we talk about this theory stuff today, I'm not going to recommend that you necessarily worry too much about memorizing a lot of stuff. But this is something that you want to memorize. You want to memorize the shape of the major scale. And it's actually really easy to do. Let's just look at it real quick. And we'll talk more about what it is and why it's important in a second. These are the octave notes, as we said before, right? Between here and here. And as we go up the major scale, we can notice how far these notes are apart from each other. We've got a little distance here. We're going to call this distance, we're going to call a step. Sometimes it's called a whole step if you want to be explicit. And this distance, this shorter distance, we call a half step. So the major scale has 2 whole steps and then a little half step. And then it's got 3 whole steps and then another little half step, right? That's the shape of the scale. We're going to get deeper into this, so just pay a little bit of attention to how that's shaped. The major scale, it's an important scale. It's used a lot musically. You'll hear it a lot this weekend if you listen to any of the concerts or you listen to any music, pretty much any song you hear on the radio. I'm exaggerating a little, but it's a very common scale. It's ubiquitous in music. So that's why it's called the major scale, but it's also not the only scale, and it doesn't make it the best scale necessarily. But it's also important for another reason, and that's that all the nomenclature of music theory, all the numbering systems and labels and all the stuff that goes into music theory is based on the major scale. So it's an important shape to know, even if you don't like it. Let's come up with a way to refer to the notes that are in the major scale. I'm going to label this note 1. I'm going to label this one 2. This one gets a 3, and I think you can predict how this is going to go. This one, you could call it 8. And you can call this 9, and you could keep going on into the next octave like that. That happens sometimes in music. But for our purposes, we're going to call this 1, because again, these are in a sense the same note. They're an octave apart. That's the magic distance that just somehow makes them the same note. We've numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Pretty straightforward. We also want a way to refer to the notes that come in between these notes. So how do we refer to this little humble note that's hanging out right here, right? Well, we're going to call this note using these terms sharp and flat. Before we said that sharp meant to go up in pitch. Whoops, give me a second here. Oh, I see what I did, sorry. We said sharp is to go up in pitch, and we said that flat was to go down in pitch, right? And there's a similar usage here. We call this note the 1 sharp because it's sharp of the 1, or we can also call it the 2 flat because it's flat of the 2. It's not that any note in here is the 2 flat. It's just this particular spot, one of the slices of 12 that we call the 2 flat or the 1 sharp. These are 2 different terms. They mean the same note. They refer to the same thing. That note just has 2 different names. This note that's in here, we're going to call this the 2 sharp or the, we're going to call it the 2 sharp or the 3 flat. Now you'll notice that there is no 3 sharp or 4 flat, right? I'm simplifying a little bit, but that's how you can think of it. There's no 3 sharp, there's no 4 flat. There's no, there is a 4 sharp and there is a 5 flat, and the naming system goes on like that. You'll notice that between the 7 and the 1, there's no note in between those either, right? Now let me simplify this stuff a little bit. I'm just going to show those that way. Got the labels down here. We got the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, and so forth. So another way to remember the major scale shape, which I said earlier was an important scale to remember, is just that the 3 and the 4 have nothing in between. Well, I should circle this. 3 and the 4 have nothing in between, and the 7 and the 1 have nothing in between. And everything else has a note in between. That's the kind of shortcut way to remember the major scale. So if you're just on your own out in the wild and you want to remember the scale, you can say, okay, let's see, we've got the 1, and I know there's a note in between, then there's the 2, note in between, 3, 4, note in between, 5, note in between, 6, 7, 1, right? You can do that, and then you know that this is filled in with a 1 sharp or a 2 flat, and so forth, right? Nice and simple. Okay, and again, the reason we're belaboring this and talking about these labels and how they work and everything is we know that all the nomenclature for music theory is coming from this. It's not that we're so fascinated with the major scale, it's just that the major scale is used for the naming systems. Okay, let me consult my notes briefly. So that's great. We've got a way to refer to notes in the major scale. Now there are other scales, as I've said several times. The major scale is not the only one. Here's another scale. Let me just pull it up real quick. This scale, you can see the first note here is a 1. The scales are always going to start on the 1. The next note is a 2, just like before in the major scale. But then the third note, instead of going to the 3 like we did before, now we're going to this note, which is the flat 3, or you could call it the 2 sharp, right? So this is a different shape of a scale, and it's got a different sound. I'll play through it. This scale, you don't have to worry about remembering this, I'm just telling you in case you're curious, is called the natural minor scale. Now it sounds different. It sounds different because we're playing different notes. Out of the 12 notes, we just selected different notes, and the naming system as a result works out a little bit differently. We've got the 1, we go to 2, we go to flat 3 or sharp 2, we go to a 4 and a 5 just like before, but then we've got a sharp 5 and a flat 6, sharp 6 or flat 7 depending on how you want to name it. But it's the same idea. We've picked a subset of the notes, we just give them a name. You can see that the naming system itself is biased to the major scale. When you play the major scale, you just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If you want to spell, they call it spelling the scale. If you want to spell the natural minor scale, you have to say 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. You know, you have to use a little bit more, it's a little bit wordier to call it. But the important thing to understand is that underneath, it's just the good old, let me turn them off real quick. Underneath, it's just the good old same 12 notes, right? That never changes for Western music. We just got those 12 notes. We're just trying to come up with a way to refer to them and describe them and so on. Okay, that's how we refer to notes. That's how we talk about scales. There's a bunch of different scales. You can make up your own scale. There's no law that says you have to play this scale or that scale. Just pick some subset of the 12 notes and play it. If you like it, it's a scale. Good for you. Now, what we've been doing so far is talking about, oops, that's no longer the natural minor scale, so let me take that off. What we've been doing so far is talking about notes in what's called a relative sense. This is relative pitch that we've been talking about. What that means is we're most concerned about the relationship of the pitches to each other. I can sing a song like this. This land is your land, this land is my land. Or I can sing the same song and go up here. This land is your land, this land is my land. Or I can go up here. This land is your land, this land is my land. No matter where on the line of pitch I slide that melody, you can still recognize it as this land is your land, right? Because all your ear really cares about musically is how those notes relate to each other. It doesn't care exactly where they're sitting on the line of pitch. So it makes a lot of sense to talk about music in a relative sense. We think about it in terms of the relationship to the notes. These notes that I've got showed on the screen here, they can slide around everywhere and they still line up with each other in the same way, right? But when you are building an instrument or you're tuning your instrument or you're going to sit down and play some music with other people, or you're going to talk about music in a more concrete way, sometimes you do need to know the specific note that you're playing. And this is when we get into what's called absolute pitch terminology. These are the note letters that you're familiar with, like A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, right? Those are absolute pitch names. The note C refers to a specific number of vibrations per second. It's maintained by a standards bureau somewhere, and it refers to a specific note. Technically, the note C refers to all of the notes that are an octave apart from C. So there's a bunch of different Cs, but in a given octave, there's one C. Anyway, we'll cover that in a second. So how does the absolute note naming system work? Well, it goes like this.
And that was like the main room.
Oh, okay. I heard some talking. It's cool. Here's how the absolute pitch naming works. We start with the letter A, then we got a B, we got a C, got a D, got an E, an F, and a G, and then it goes back to A, and it repeats the cycle. And just like before, we've got notes in between some of these notes. Here we've got an A sharp, which is also known as a B flat. I'm sorry if this is illegible. It's really hard to draw on this tablet. Here's a C sharp, sort of. There we go. And here's a D flat. Here's D sharp and E flat, and so on. And just as before, there's the same thing, F sharp and G sharp and A flat and so forth in between here. Just as before, there's a couple spots where there are no notes in between. There's nothing between a B and a C, and there's nothing between a B and between an E and an F, right? This is just a different naming system. It bears a lot of resemblance to the relative system we learned before, but don't stress too much about that. Just learn it as its own kind of standalone thing. Nothing between B and C, nothing between E and F. Everything else has a note in between it. And just as before, you know, D sharp and E flat refer to the same note, right? Okay, I'm gonna magically make that appear on the screen as well. So there are the absolute pitch names. Again, these are specific frequencies, right? Specific notes that are fixed, you can't slide them around. So how do these two note naming worlds combine? How do they overlap with each other? How do they interface with each other? Well, what they do is the relative stuff can slide around. I'll do that again here. It can slide around anywhere on the line of pitch, but you can see that the absolute note names just stay there in one place. They don't go anywhere. So if you want to play a major scale, henceforth, you don't know how to do that based on what I've said. If I said the major scale is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, play a major scale, you'd say, what, like floating in space? Like where is this scale actually happening? To do that, you have to choose a spot, an actual spot, to make that pattern real. So that was a little vague, but let me show you on the screen here. Let's say we wanted to play a major scale. We know the shape of it, but we need to pick a spot for it to exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide that shape, that scale of that major scale is sliding around here. And I'm going to slide it down. Let's slide it down to an E. And what I mean by that is that the one, the root, or they call it the tonic of the scale here, I've now lined it up with the E, right? Remember, the E is like a fixed point on the line of pitch. So I've lined the home of our scale, the tonic, up with the E. And now you can see that because the relative pitch names use this 12 slice system, right? These little 12 slices. The absolute pitch names use the same system. It's just fixed on the line of pitch. So I've lined the two up. I've lined the one up with the E. And now we can see, sort of emerging out of the pattern of names, we can see what the E scale, what the major scale based on E looks like. The one note is the E. It's right here. I know that the two note is the next scale, the next note in the major scale, and that is this F sharp or G flat. I'm just going to call the sharps here. So that's F sharp. The next one is the 3 note. So that's a G sharp. And then the 4th note in the scale is an A. The 5th one is a B. And I just follow, good, I'm just following these highlighted notes here, right? So that's C sharp, D sharp, and E. So now I know, let's see if this, there we go. Okay, so it goes. Right, I've now played the major scale in that particular key, just like magic. You don't have to be able to do this in your head. What happened? There we go. You don't have to be able to do this in your head. And to be honest, most musicians don't. Most musicians either don't know about it or care about it, or they just kind of learn the patterns of what notes happen to be in the E major scale and they don't worry about why. Or they have learned it sort of the way you learned your multiplication tables. When you're young and you're presented with multiplication tables for the first time, it seems really overwhelming and intimidating, but after you memorize them, it's not a big deal. The important thing I think you should take away from this is that conceptually, this is very simple. It's just two different naming systems, this absolute naming system that doesn't slide around, and then the relative naming system that does. And you can just see that as they slide around, it's going to have, different implications for which notes get called what in what scale and so forth. It might not be an easy thing to do just off the top of your head to spell a scale, a major scale, rooted at any note. And you don't necessarily need to acquire that skill. But the more of this you learn and the faster and easier it becomes, the more powerful the music theory can be to just sort of help you out when you're trying to figure something out or you're trying to write a tune or figure out chords for something and so forth. So let's go through this process again, just for the sake of exercise. I'm going to slide this major scale to... Do I have room on screen? Okay, give me a second because I need to make an adjustment. I'm going to slide it all the way down to here, right? So now I've slid I've slid the tonic, the 1, down to a C. So now when we spell the scale, what do we get? Again, we're just following these highlighted notes. That's the major scale we're interested in, right? And we get C, where do we go? C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C, right? C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. Look at that. When we spell the scale based on C, there are no sharps or flats in the scale. We didn't have to say sharp or flat. So you can see that the absolute pitch names, they also have a bias towards a particular scale. In this case, the major scale based on C has this magical property that you don't have to say sharp or flat. Doesn't mean it's better, doesn't mean it's simpler or more complex or anything. Underneath, you just have the same 12 slices of notes that you had in the beginning. It's just the way the naming system plays out when you slide the scale around. All right, let's do one last example just to prove some points here. If we've been doing the major scale, we've been figuring out the major scale when its tonic is slid to a particular spot. But what happens when we're using a different scale? Let's go back to that natural minor scale that we played before. Remember the one that sounds like this. That's just as legitimate a scale as the major scale. And we get the same kind of thing. We've got a pattern of notes that we're using in between the octave, right? We've got our relative labels, 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, and 1. And you can see that when we line the 1 up, oops, a little sloppy there, sorry. When you line the 1 up with the F, we get a natural minor scale rooted at F. And in that case, we get F, G, A flat, B flat, C, D flat, E flat, and F, right? Same process, just a different pattern. It may seem kind of magical when experienced musicians just know, like, oh, what's the flat third in G? It's B flat. They just kind of have that stuff to hand, but it's just a process of familiarity. And so I'm going to leave that at that. This ability to spell scales, useful. It's not mandatory, but what you should understand is that it's happening, is that it exists, and it's a thing that you can do, so that when you encounter these scales and you encounter the numbers and that kind of stuff, now you have kind of a grounding for what's going on there. Okay, we're about a half hour in. I'm just doing a little check on the schedule. So I want to copy. Yes?
We do have a question from Jimmy and Jane who asked, they were wondering what program is being used to display the pitches.
It's a program that I wrote. It's I'm using the audio program Reaper, and you can write custom software in it. And I just made it so that I could show this. I could, cool. If you want to contact me afterwards or whatever, I'd be happy to get you a copy if it would be useful too. If the reason you're asking is that you would find it useful for spelling scales, then let me refer you to the resources section of the Bellingham Folk Festival, because there's a thing in there that I made called the pitch wheel. And I won't spend too much time explaining this, but it's basically a tool to let you do the same kind of thing. It has like oh boy, this is harder than it looks. That's a circle, okay? It's a PDF that you can print out, and then you can cut out the circles, and they fit onto each other, and it's got like a grid of notes on the outside that are like, I can't remember exactly what it looks like. It's like this would be 1 sharp, 2 flat, this would be 2 sharp, 3 flat, 3, 4. All the numbers go along, and then there's a wheel on the inside that represents the absolute pitches, and you can just rotate it around and line it up, and then you can figure out what any scale is in any key and that kind of stuff, just as a shortcut. I do want to stress, though, that like this stuff is, no, I'm not going to make that claim. I'll just say, like, the more you want to practice that and work on it, that's awesome. I mean, I'm a nerd about it. I think it's great to practice it. But it really is the kind of thing that the more you can do it in your head and sort of on the fly, the more useful it is. So really lean in that direction. Try to get there as quick as you can. But any other questions before I move on? All right, I'll take that as a no. I hear somebody. Is there a question or something? No. Okay. So I just want to cover a couple more terms. They're just things you're going to run into if you're out there in the crazy world trying to do some music theory. We talked about sharp and flat. There's a third term called natural, and that just means that here, let me reset some things real quick. Major scale. Right, so this is the third, right? This is the 3 note, I should say. We said that, let's do this off the 5th, I'm sorry. Here's the 5 note. We said that if that goes sharp, it's the 5 sharp. If we go flat, it's the 5 flat, right? And this is the natural 5. That's the term, natural. Natural means neither sharp nor flat. There's this other concept of majorness and minorness. And if we have time to talk about chords, we're going to talk about that some more. But what does it mean for a scale to be major or minor? Well, we've already learned about the major scale. It is a particular scale. It's on the screen right now. You know it well. It's got the half step is between the 3 and the 4 and the 7 and the 1, right? That's the major scale. But there are actually lots of major scales. The other major scales aren't the major scale, but they are major scales. There are also minor scales. We saw one called the natural minor scale. Well, what makes these things major or minor? It's not just their importance. There's actually a musical term. There's a musical concept here. We look at that 3 note. And if that 3 note is in its natural position, like it is in the major scale, then we call that scale a major scale. It's actually a little more complicated than that, but as a first draft, take that as a fair summary. Excuse me. If that note, instead of being at that natural 3 position, if it's in its flat 3rd position, here, then we call that a minor scale. So any scale that's got this note in it, it's a minor scale. Any scale that's got this note in it, it's a major scale. If it has neither of these 2 notes in it, or if it has both of them in it, then it's neither major nor minor. It's kind of ambiguous and it's just not really defined. But those scales aren't as common in Western music, so they have this term major and minor. Why do we have these terms for these scales? Why do they deserve their own, why is that 3rd so important? Long story and not even necessarily answerable. Don't worry about it. It's just another term, just referring to sort of a category of scales. Okay, and then the other term that's good to know is key. What does that mean? The key of a piece of music is essentially just referring to whether or not the scale is major or minor and which absolute note name the scale is located on. So let's say we had a natural minor scale. Let me switch that over real quick. There's our natural minor. And let's say we anchored this on the D sharp, right? We would then say that the key of this music is D sharp minor because it's a minor scale and it's anchored on the D sharp note, or E flat minor. Let me get my drawing back together. So we call that E flat minor. You could call it E flat natural minor, but usually you just say a small m means minor. So that would be the key of that piece of music, okay? All right, let me get that off there. So what we've covered so far, I'm just gonna do a lightning recap. Infinite line of pitch. It's fluid. It goes high, it goes low. We pick a spot on it somewhere. We call that a note. We go to a magical distance that's a long story as to why that magical distance is what it is. We're not going to talk about it today. Called an octave. That magical distance makes those two notes sound like they're almost the same note, even though one is higher and one's lower. Inside of that octave, we divide it up into 12 pieces. We play only some of those notes, and that's what we call the scale. There's lots of different kinds of scales. The one that's most important to learn first is the major scale. Not because it's the best, but just because it's used a lot and because the nomenclature is derived from it. We take that major scale and we number it, and we come up with this sharp flat system to refer to the notes in between the notes in that major scale. Then we talked about the absolute pitch names, which have a similar naming system, but it's fixed on the line of pitch, and we talked about how to line the two up in order to spell scales of any shape at any particular key. So the last thing I want to talk about, I'm just going to do a double check on the time. Last thing I want to talk about is modes. So I think I'll just talk about modes and we'll go from there. A mode is a really useful thing for a musician, and it's an important thing to know about when you're playing folk music, like the music that's here at the Bellingham Folk Festival. Old-time music, Irish, Scottish, English folk music, and traditions from all over the world use this concept of modes. Modes are an interesting thing to talk about because it's a really simple concept. It's really trivial almost once you understand it. But talking about it for some reason sometimes it gets a little confusing, so I'm going to do my best to explain it here. Turning back to let me simplify the stuff on the screen here for a second. When we're playing this major scale that we were playing, right? Oh, that's the wrong scale, hang on. There's the major scale. When we're playing the major scale, you have the benefit of seeing the visuals here, right? You can see the golden bars here that are indicating the octaves, and you can see the notes dancing around, and you know that this is the tonic of the scale. And probably also because you've listened to a lot of music in your life, and also because I'm doing some musical tricks to kind of emphasize things, this feels like the root of the scale. Especially if I play a melody that you know, maybe you know Joy to the World. Right? It's hard to escape the musical feeling that this is the home of the scale. It's the one, it's the tonic of the scale, right? But if you walk in the room when someone is playing a melody, you don't have the benefit of these labels, right? You don't have the benefit of these golden things, and you don't have the benefit of this scale. All that you have is sort of this array of notes that exists in the world, and you hear this. Right? And now all you've got to go on, when your brain immediately starts trying to interpret the music, it's trying to kind of get its bearings and figure out, whether you're conscious of it or not, your brain is trying to figure out the scale that's being used, in a manner of speaking. It's trying to figure out where the root of that scale is and what the relationship between all these notes are and which notes are in the scale and which aren't and all that. And your brain sometimes can have a tough time. If you play Joy to the World, the listener will probably say, okay, here, that's the root of the scale. But check this out. I'm gonna turn the major scale back on here for a second. And as I play through these notes, I'm gonna play from the 1 to the 1, just like I was before. Pretty straightforward, right? Let's say instead of playing from the 1 to the 1, I'm gonna play, let me turn these labels back on. I'm going to play from the 6, which is down here. This is just the 6 and the next octave down, to the 6 that's up here. So I'm still only playing notes from the same major scale. I'm not adding any new magical notes, just the major scale notes, but I'm going to play from the 6 to the 6. So what happens there, I played from the 6 to the 6. Your brain, given no hints or no other clues, is going to interpret these notes differently. It's going to hear this as the tonic of the scale, and it's going to hear this as the octave from it, right? It's going to think that those gold bars are actually in that location. In other words, your brain's going to interpret those notes differently. So, okay, great. Your brain interprets it differently. What's the big deal? What happens when you interpret it differently? Well, let me turn these off here. Well, no, I'll leave them on. Let me get back to this. Okay, so where were we? We were talking about how I was playing from the 6 to the 6, right? So if your ear, if you walk in that room and you just hear those notes, and again, you don't have the benefit of these little gold marks and stuff, your brain is going to interpret this as the 1, right? Your brain, and again, your brain may not call it the 1, but there's a musical notion of that being the root of the scale. So what are the consequences of that? What are the implications? Well, if this is the 1, then that means that it's going to interpret this next note here as the next note in the scale. And we know that if it's a whole step up, we call that a 2. We have a label for the note that's a whole step above the tonic. It's 2. And then what's this? Let me turn these octave notes off because they're just confusing now. Now we go up to this third spot in the octave. Well, what's this? This is what we called before the 2 sharp or the 3 flat, right? Because we know that between the 2 and the 3 would have been here. It's a whole step between the 2 and the 3. This is a half step, so we call this the 2 sharp or the 3 flat. Well, what's this next note? It's the 4. Right? The 3 would have been here. There's nothing between the 3 and the 4, but we didn't play that note. We played it here. So the point is, when your ear interprets the 6 as the framework, as the octave framework of the scale, you get a different scale. We'll call this 5 sharp or 6 flat. We call this 6 sharp or 7 flat, and the 1, right? We've only played notes from this original major scale. If you look at the green ones on the bottom, the green numbers on the bottom here, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? But if your ear interprets it like this, now we're looking at the white letters on the top. So the point is, your ear has interpreted the notes a little differently, and the result is that you've got a different scale with a different feel to it. This is great news because it means that anytime you learn a scale with 7 notes, you're actually learning 7 scales at the same time. There's the scale in its normal position, and then there's all the modes of the scale. This is a mode. This is the 6th mode of the major scale. Now this particular mode of this particular scale happens to be the natural minor scale that we've been playing around with for the last 45 minutes. It's just another way to think of that scale. Modes are really useful on instruments like this. I play these low whistles, right, or penny whistles, same idea. Any instrument that has a sort of restricted set of notes, like this whistle only has 6 holes in it. You can play 7 notes on this whistle, right? It plays the major scale. This might be loud on the headphones, so just a heads up there. That's the major scale, right? The major scale is great and everything, but after a while you might get a little tired of everything sounding like it's in the major scale. So if you use these modes, you can use the same notes, but you just sort of shift where you think of the tonic is living. So we're going to play it. I'll play it, in this case, instead of the 6, I'll play it from the 2nd note. I'll play the 2nd mode of the major scale. I'm just going to go up to the 2, and I'm going to think of the 2 as the lowest and highest note. Again, I'm just playing these major scale notes, but I'm just sort of shifting how I'm emphasizing them. It's a great trick. And so if you're walking around the festival and people are talking about modal music, or this is in this mode and that mode, they just mean there's an original scale, usually the major scale, but you can make modes out of any scale. Usually the major scale, and they're just saying, just shift your perspective on where that tonic is actually from, where the tonic actually lives. That's modes. Modes also, I should mention that modes have there's a variety of names of modes. You might hear Dorian and Lydian and Mixolydian and stuff like that. Those are just names of the major scale modes. There's nothing special about there. It's just more terminology. Surprise, surprise. There's always more terminology in the world of music theory. Okay, so what I thought we would do, that covers most of what I wanted to talk about. Let's see what time is. We still have 15 minutes. What I thought we could do is stop and just do question and answer stuff. If you guys had questions, or if anything I was saying was unclear, or if I needed to talk more about something, I could be happy to do that. If you didn't really have any questions, or if it was more interesting, I could go on and talk about chords and sort of the basics of how chords are built and named and that kind of stuff. So I'll just throw it to our wonderful assistant and see if we've got any questions on the floor.
We don't have any questions so far. We do have feedback, though, about this is an amazing, clear explanation.
Awesome.
It's great to see the visual.
Yeah, it helps, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll give you 15 more seconds to raise your hand for a question, and then we're gonna just plow into chords.
Katie votes for chords would be super helpful.
Okay. Oh, I should say also 2 things. I make YouTube videos about music theory that they'll visually look very similar to what we're doing here. If you go to YouTube and you Google my name, Casey Connor, Connor, and music theory, that should get you to some of the videos. I make videos about how to write a melody, how to choose chords for a melody. This kind of intro stuff is on there. So if you need a refresher or you forget any of it, you can go to those videos as a reference. As I mentioned also, that pitch wheel thing is in the resources. And there was something else I was going to say. What was I just going to say? Oh, I was going to say that I'm also teaching 2 other music theory workshops this weekend. One of them is tomorrow at a time that I forget, but look it up on the schedule. It's going to be an intermediate version of this. We're going to basically start where we leave off here and continue. It'll be a little more application-oriented too, hopefully. We're going to talk more about chords and chord naming, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about chord progressions and some common scales and stuff like that. So let's talk about chords now.
I think it looks like Linda has a question. Did you want to ask that is that about jazz?
Yeah, that was basically my question. Where does a jazz scale fit into this? How does he work that in? Or is that beyond this workshop?
The specific term jazz scale?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know that there is a scale called a jazz scale. I'll say that jazz in general is just an extension of exactly what we've been talking about. There are a lot of scales that are kind of in the category jazz scale, and they usually refer to scales that have a note or 2 added. So, like the bebop scale or the whole tone scale is kind of a different thing, but they're just different. It's just different selections of these 12 notes. And there are music theoretical reasons behind why that are definitely beyond the scope of this talk. But there's nothing really, there's nothing sort of like magical or fundamentally different about them. They're just other scales. There's hundreds of scales, used in the world. As far as what you might encounter at a folk festival, there might be like 2 or 3 commonly used scales, maybe 5 or 10 if you want to be really generous. But yeah, you get into the world of jazz, and they're doing a lot more fancy stuff in terms of scales. They use more varied chords and pull all kinds of tricks because they really learn their music theory early in the world of jazz. Does that answer the question well enough? I love these moments of awkward silence. I'm going to assume yes. Raise your hand again if you need more clarification on that. I'd be happy to give it. I'm also doing a music theory Q&A, which I'm 99% sure is on Sunday. And that's just like an open session thing. And I'm a little worried that no one's going to come or ask any questions. So if you have a song that you're working on or a melody you can't figure out, or you're trying to figure out what some chord is or why some chord works or why some chord doesn't work or whatever, any question about music theory stuff or just details about, tell me more about this scale or something, come to that session. It's just going to be unstructured and more of like a back and forth kind of discussion. That's on Sunday. Okay, let's talk about chords in 11 minutes. Okay. First, before we talk about chords, we have to establish a little bit more terminology. And I promise this is the last batch of terminology. We're going to talk about intervals. You've already learned the name of several intervals. You learned the octave. I guess I'll just do it with these notes here. We learned the octave, which was this distance, right? An interval, or like an octave, is just a measurement of distance on the line of pitch. So what I've drawn here is an octave between the gold note and the gold note. This is also an octave, right? Between those two notes. It's the same distance. It doesn't have to be between scale notes. It could be from the notes that are not in the scale. Doesn't matter. It's just like a yardstick. It's just how far apart are these two pitches. If they're that far apart, it's an octave. We learned a couple other intervals. We learned the half step and we learned the whole step, right? And this is a half step, and this is a half step, and this is a half step, and this is a whole step, and this is a whole step, and this is a whole step. There's a whole other world of interval nomenclature. And for one thing, I'm not an expert in it. For another, you don't really need to worry about too much of it, but we'll talk about some of them. Like everything else in music theory, it's biased towards this major scale shape naming system. So we talked about the whole step. Well, that interval, that's a whole step. It has or a step for short, that has another name, and that's a second. And that's because it's the same as the distance between the 1 and the 2, right? We call that interval a second. Just like the measurement of time, right? So that's a second. Just as before, this is also a second, this is a second, so forth. As long as that's that distance, you call it a second. Well, then you could predict what this is called. This is called a third, if you got that interval, right? If you talk about this interval, you got a fourth, right? If you go up to here, you got a fifth. If you go up to here, you got a sixth. Go up to here, you have a seventh. And this, we already learned, is called the octave, right? Great. Now, just as with notes where we had sharp and flat and natural, we've got a similar set of terms for intervals. We call them augmented. Again, sorry for my handwriting here. My handwriting is bad usually, but on a tablet, it's really bad. Oh, gosh. Oh my God. Diminished. That says diminished. And then perfect. Augmented means your interval is made a little wider. Diminished means it's made a little shorter. And perfect means it's sort of in its normal form. So this interval we talked about was the fifth. We could also be explicit and call that a perfect fifth. If we make the interval a little longer, we call this a, well, for various reasons, you don't usually call this well, you can call it an augmented fifth. You could also call it, well, never mind. See, you can tell by my floundering that we're getting into the hairy nomenclature. Call it an augmented fifth. If we look at this interval, we call it a diminished fifth, right? Very straightforward, except that in the world of intervals, there's a lot of gotchas and things that you don't expect. For example, if you talk about this interval, we said it was a third. If we talk about the interval, it's a little shorter, you actually call this a minor third instead of a diminished third. You call it a minor third. And the same thing happens with the sixth. This is a sixth interval. And if you got a little shorter interval, it's a minor sixth and so on. So again, you don't have to sweat that stuff. This is kind of getting into the, like, if you're a music theory student, you should know this kind of territory. The important thing you need to understand is that when you're talking about chords, these intervals are going to come into play a lot. And the one I want you to pay a special attention to is that third interval, okay? So let's look at that a little closer. It's the distance between the 1 and the 3. I said intervals are the same no matter where you measure them from. So this, make sure I get this right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, that's also a third, right? Doesn't have to be rooted there, but it's named because if you root it at the tonic, it's between the 1 and the 3. They call it a third. Okay, so a third is, how many half steps is a third? 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 4 half steps that comprise a third. The same 4 half steps are happening here. 2, 3, 4, right? And I said that a minor third is what you get when you shrink that interval a little bit. Well, how many half steps are in this minor third? 1, 2, 3. Okay, good to know. Just put that in your pocket. 3 half steps for a minor third, 4 half steps for a major third, or just a third. Oh, I didn't tell you that. A regular third is also called a major third. When you shrink it down, you call it a minor third. Just a naming quirk. One of many naming quirks. All right, let's talk chords for real. If you're working on a piece of music, you're playing a scale, you've got certain notes that you're playing and certain notes that you aren't playing, and you want to come up with some chords to play with that melody. Well, a chord is just a combination of notes, right? It could be any combination. You can play this chord, you can play this chord, you can play this chord, you can play this chord. Those are all chords. They have different vibes. Some of them you might like, some of them you might not like. We're going to talk about the most traditional chords, the most kind of conventional chords that you might come across. So the first thing we're going to say is, okay, we're playing certain notes, we're not playing other notes. So when I make the chords, I'm going to use notes from the scale, and I'm not going to use notes that aren't in the scale. And the other thing I'm going to do is, let's say I start making a chord and I want to start on the tonic of the scale. I'm going to make a chord and I want to use this note. What you do is you pick every other note as you go up the scale for a total of 3 notes. So we're going to pick this note here. We're going to skip this one, and then we're going to play this one. We're going to skip the next one, and then we're going to play this one. Why do we do it this way? Long story, out of the scope of today's talk, but that's the point. This is the pattern, right? These 3 notes. We are playing, in this case, the 1 note, 3 note, and the 5 note. And that's how you shape your most, they call this a triad, you don't need to know that, but that's the most basic chord shape. There it is. And it sounds good, right? It's a good, solid, basic chord. And we note that we did this by picking notes out of the scale, and we note that there is a major third as this first interval, right? Because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, that's messy, but you get the point. 4 half steps in that interval, right? Okay, we're going to give this chord a special name. We're going to call it the 1 chord. We're going to use a Roman numeral instead of using an Arabic numeral. We're going to use the Roman numeral 1. Just a convention, that means it's the chord. Okay, that's what we refer to the 1 chord. This is just a shortcut symbol that means, hang on. It's a shortcut symbol that means play those notes in that pattern. That's all it is. Great, let's get rid of these real quick. Let's make another chord. This time, let's make a chord starting on the 2 note, and we're going to do the same pattern. We skip the next note, so we do the 2, we skip the 3 note, and we play the 4, we skip the 5, and we play the 6. Okay? This is, again, same pattern, just 3 notes. Don't worry about why, it's just the convention for now. This is another chord. It's based on the 2 note. We use the 2 note, the 4 note, and the 6 note. And we're going to give this a little symbol. We're going to call it the 2. And because this interval has 1, 2, 3 half steps, we know that's a minor third interval. And that is what defines a minor chord. When this interval in the lower chunk here is a minor third interval, we call this a minor chord, and we write a little M next to it to mean minor. This is a major chord. It doesn't have any special indication. It's just assumed to be major. But when it's a minor chord, you put a little M next to it. Great, there's our 2 chord, our 2 minor chord, I should say, right? And we can continue doing that. I'm going to do a little time check because I have a feeling this is going to run away from me. Yeah, we're just about done. I'll sum this up. We'll cover this a little more in the next music theory section tomorrow. So if this is feeling good and you want to learn more about chords, you'll have to come to that. But I'll just shortcut it and tell you that if you keep doing this as you go through each of the scale degrees, we're going to go to the next chord based on the 3 note. It will also end up, I'm running out of room on my thing here. I'll just have to go down. It will be a 3 minor chord. When we do the 4 chord, in other words, the chord that is based on this note, the 4 chord, those 3 notes, those are all on the scale. That's just a regular 4 chord. Then we get a 5 chord. I'm running out of space. Sorry for the sloppiness here. Then we get a 6 minor chord. And the 7 chord is what's called a diminished chord. We'll cover that next time. Don't worry about it. But you can see that the important thing to take away here is that the scale itself gave us these chords, right? If we had a different scale, we would have gotten different chords. But we did this pattern where we just picked a note in the scale and we went every other note and we got this triad shape. We got this standard chord shape. And some of them were major chords and some of them were minor chords, just depending on how the notes kind of lined up with that shape. That's kind of the first step on how you generate some chords to work with your scale. Now, if we had more time, we could talk about how to apply this to a particular key. If you're playing in G, how do you figure out what all these chords are and so on? And that's the kind of thing that we'll probably talk about in the next session. So with that, just to respect your time, it's 7:15 and I'll finish, but I'll hang around. I don't know how long we can hang around if someone else is coming up after me, but be happy to hang around and answer questions and stuff if people wanted to talk more about it. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Casey, Kelly did have a great question. I wonder if I'd be interested in the class where you have more time to talk about it. But she asked about is this specific to Western music, or would this class make sense if you taught it in India?
It's a very interesting question. It is basically Western music theory that we're talking about. And I did mean to make that clear. I'm sorry if I didn't. The question about India in specific is an interesting one. They do basically use the same kind of 12 tones, but they're a lot more flexible with it. And so the short answer to the question is, yeah, this is Western music theory. This would apply to European music. It would apply to North and South American current music. I'm not talking about like native traditions necessarily. This applies to a lot of music, but there are traditions like Arabic music and Indian music, gamelan, gong orchestras in Bali and stuff, that just are using different systems altogether. But there is a lot of crossover because the reason for these 12 notes and the reasons for the octave sounding like this magical distance and stuff, a lot of this stuff is rooted in physiology and physics and things that aren't cultural accidents, So it kind of depends on which exact specific thing you're talking about. But for Indian music, for example, the thing that I think of first is the fact that it's a largely melodically driven music. They don't really have chord progressions in Indian music, for example. So a whole huge chunk of Western music theory isn't particularly applicable. But they do a lot of super sophisticated stuff in melody that we don't. And so that's the way those things balance. It's kind of like you'll get some crossover. A sitar, for example, like here's a guitar. The frets on this guitar are the same thing as the notes that you see down below in that diagram. These are the places on the line of pitch where the notes exist, right? And this magical spot at the top of the guitar, the 12th fret, is not that's not a coincidence that there's 12 notes and there's 12 frets to the octave and so on. So this is the same thing. If you look at a sitar, it has 12 frets to the octave. They actually remove one of the frets, but you can see where the gap is. It's the same, what I'm just saying is it's the same kind of conceptual thing of 12 tones. On the sitar, however, you can slide those frets around a little bit. You can budge them up or budge them down a little bit, and there's all kinds of interesting effects that they get from that. So complicated question to answer, but this is definitely mostly a Western music theory kind of perspective that I'm talking about, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Maybe see you at the next workshops.